Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to show you how to paint these 3 loose watercolor florals freehand. I'm going to paint a dahlia flower, a peony, and also irises. Since I'm going to paint them freehand, it's best to understand the shapes and at least get used to sketching it without erasing, so let's break it down through the sketch. I want the overall silhouette to be an oval, which is what I started with, and I added a smaller one to indicate the center of the flower. The silhouette is oval because we're looking at this from more of a side view, and if you want a higher viewpoint, the silhouette would be more circular from the top. To start, I want to bunch the large petals together until it reaches the center, and because of the side viewpoint, please take notice of the foreshortened shapes of the petals. The open petals at the bottom are slightly shorter as it's closer to our view, and as it gets to the top it starts to round up, and I also want to make the edges slightly frilly. And here I'm adding some open petals which are facing slightly downward so we can see the inside of the petals a bit more. At the top center you can see some lines. This is to indicate the stamen of the flowers, and I want to actually line the center of the stamen, imagining it going all the way down for the stem so it stays nice and center. Next, I'm going to quickly demonstrate the different angles where you see more of the center of the flower. This becomes more rounded compared to what we initially drew out, so please choose the angle that you like and practice it before applying it to your painting. Take note that if you want to paint in a higher viewpoint where we can see the center more, you would be able to see more of the back petals as well. If you want a flower bud to be part of the composition, you can simplify the shape by creating a circle with a slight pointy top and sepal leaves wrapping around the flower bud, which helps to create the round form. As for the leaves, I'm just going to draw out large ordinary leaves with pointy edges, but I want to play around with how it falls as well so it looks more natural and it just doesn't stick up randomly. Next, for the peony flower, I'm going to be using these 4 colors, starting with Indigo by Schmincke, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, and Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke. Since I'm going to be painting a single flower, I'm going to use my large brush here to cover a larger space. And for the flower, I'm going to use a mix of titanium gold ochre with vermilion to create this peachy color. You can also use other color combinations or other hues as well. I'm painting this in real time so you can see the movement of my brush, and I'm going to start out by painting on the individual petals just like how I sketched that out before, but I'm filling in the space instead of creating the outlines. Before painting on the petals, I already had the oval in mind, and I already imagined how the petals will more or less be placed. I forgot to also mention that I'm using a light consistency here, so when this dries, it'll become much lighter. After I paint on the petals within the oval that I imagined, I'm going to add the ones which are facing downwards. If you notice, I also left out a tiny bit of line or negative space. This creates a barrier so the paint doesn't just run into each other, creating a giant puddle or silhouette. After painting on the petals, I found that the color was a bit too dark for my liking still, so while the surface is still a bit damp, I ended up taking off some paint using tissue. Next, I'm going to add the darker values between the petals, so I added vermilion into the previous mixture, and this is a much thicker consistency compared to the base layer. I'm using a really light load on my brush, so you can see that my brush comes to a very fine tip that I can twist around so it fits into the tiny spaces, and certain areas here, as you can tell, is much drier than others. You can tell from the edges. If the edges run into the previous base color, that means it's still a touch damp, whereas the edges at the top is much sharper because it's completely dry. What you don't want to do is paint on a completely wet surface where it's still shiny and puddling wet. If that's the case, please leave it to dry for a while. If not, your paint is just going to run and travel too fast, covering that whole area. As for the stamen of the flowers, here I use a really thick consistency of new Gamboge, and again I use a really dry brush load or a light brush load to create those really fine lines, or you can also switch to a smaller brush if you would like. Then with the rest of the space, if there are any white spaces left on top of the stamens, I'm just going to fill it in using the same mixture for the darker values, but with added vermilion to make the color even more vibrant. Moving on to the stem, I used a mix of indigo and new Gamboge, and I'm using more new Gamboge in the mixture, so you can see that the green is quite light. I'm using a dry to light brush load here, again, so I can create those really fine lines. As I'm painting on the stems, I like to wiggle my brush ever so slightly, so the lines are a little bit more natural looking instead of it looking very straight and stiff. Here I'm adding some leaves under the flower to frame it slightly, and because part of the leaves are hidden underneath, I want to paint very close to the flower petals, in which case you do want the petals to be completely dry. If not, the green is just going to run into the petals. For some of the leaves, I also want to start with the middle instead of the end, as parts are covered. While the surface of the leaves are still a bit damp, sometimes I like to redirect the paint towards the area where it's growing out of the stem or somewhere within shadow to create a darker value, or you can also do this by adding more pigment in those darker areas. I like to play with the size of the leaves, and just like the stem, instead of just doing one swoop for the leaves, I like to wiggle my brush ever so slightly so the edges are slightly uneven to create movement. After adding on the leaves, I felt like the stem looks too thin and frail, so I'm going to add a bit of thickness by using the same mix before. This time I added a little bit of that vermilion mixture. I'm doing this instead of adding indigo because if I add indigo, the color would turn to a cooler green similar to the leaves, but instead I want the stem to have a different tone of green, which is on the warm side. I felt like the top is too empty since I painted the flower a little bit too low, so I'm going to extend the composition by adding more leaves at the top. Though I'm just adding those leaves randomly, I still want the growth to make sense, which is why I added this additional stem for the leaves that I'm adding to grow out of, but I'm just going to position it behind the flower. After this, I'm going to add some shadows underneath the stamen using a little bit of indigo mixed into the base color. I'm going to use a very thin consistency of this so it's not too dark and place it right behind the first two petals. Again, I'm using a light brush load so the tip of my brush comes to a very sharp tip. And if it's a little bit too dark like this one, while it's still damp, I just took off the excess pigment using tissue. Then with the green that I still had on my palette in a medium to thick consistency, I just added some line details for the midribs and folds for the leaves. I do want to make sure that the base color is completely dry though, so the darker color won't bleed into the base. And that's it for the peony flower. Next, let's move on to the dahlia. Just like before, let's start by sketching it out. Since I want to draw a large one, the dahlia usually is heavy enough so it would face the sun. So I'm going to paint this one later on facing towards us. So I started with the center and then just adding on the petals layer by layer. From what I've read, this dahlia type is called cafe au lait. The colors tend to be a bit more on the creamy side, sometimes a soft pink or soft peach, which is why the name is called cafe au lait. And the petals tend to curl slightly at the tip, creating a soft and elegant texture. Just like the previous flower, you do want to align the center of the flower to the stem, so it looks like the stem is growing right out of the center. Then I added some additional ones for the leaves. As for the leaves, these are quite large flowers, so I do want to make sure that the leaves are large enough as well, and the edges are textured. For the flower bud, I'm going to treat it just like before by creating a circular shape or an oval with the sepals wrapping around it, and I'm going to connect it to the main stem. To make the leaves look more natural, I'm still going to play with the size, so some are larger and some are smaller. This one may seem really simple, but the tricky part is actually to get the circular silhouette of the petals. So you can practice this by drawing out a guideline for the circle, because the petals are quite layered. So when you're adding on the layers, we need to be aware of the length to keep them nice and even. This is something that you might want to practice visually as well as for muscle memory before you start painting. After this, I'm going to show you the colors that I'm going to be using, which is quite similar to the previous flower. This is Indigo by Schmincke, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke. Now let's begin to paint. I'm going to start with a very thick consistency of Titanium Gold Ochre to paint dots for the center of the flower. If you notice, I also switched to a smaller brush here using my size 4 synthetic brush. I want the color of this flower to be a muted light pink, and for the pink itself, I used a mix of Titanium Gold Ochre with Quin Red and a tiny bit of indigo. You can see that the color here is quite dark in terms of value, but this is because I want the center to be darker and for the flower petals to be progressively lighter as I paint towards the outer layers. Before I made this dark pink, you can see on my palette that there's this peachy mixture that's from Quin Red and Titanium Gold Ochre mixed with a lot of water, so it's very light. And this is what I mixed into the dark pink to create this lighter tone. I'm going to limit the amount of dark pink that I mix into the ratio because you can see that I've mixed in a really thick consistency, and I'm just going to keep adding more water bit by bit as I get towards the outer layers of petals. By the way, as I'm painting the petals radially, some angles might be a little bit uncomfortable on your wrist as you paint. This is what partly causes the silhouette to not be circular later on, so if that's the case, feel free to twist and rotate your paper around so you can reach those awkward angles. After I've painted a few layers, I'm going to go back to certain petals to separate them if I feel like they're merging together. When I was doing this though, I found that the base layer is still a little bit damp, so I'm going to leave it till later until it's completely dry, and I'll just get back to it again. I also felt like the center was a bit too yellow compared to the rest of the flowers, so I decided to dot in using the same color mixture as well. Then still, again using the same color, I'm going to paint the bulb, starting with a light consistency for the base layer. Then while the surface is still a little bit damp, I added in some lines following the cross contour lines using a thick consistency of the dark pink. And I also added the sepals, again following the curvature and adding more underneath. For the sepals, I used the same mixture as the previous flower, which is from New Gamboge, and a little bit of indigo. As for the stem, I use again the same mixture with a bit more New Gamboge as well as a bit of that dark pink mix. Now I'm going to go back to the petals again after it's completely dry and use the same pink mixture as before to give some outlines. This will also give a pointier tip to the petals. However, I'm limiting the amount of outlines because this is supposed to be just extra detail to those petals as redefinition, and also to make the ends of the petals look a little bit more delicate. And if you end up outlining every single one, you might turn it a bit too cartoony in terms of style. Next, for the leaves, I'm using the same mixture as the stem. And just like the previous flower, while the surface is still damp, I like to redirect the excess pigment or add a slightly thicker consistency at the bottom where the leaf touches the stem. And this time I also want to be a little bit more intentional as I'm painting the leaves. I want to create strokes directed to the midrib of the leaves to create those uneven and slightly sharp edges. For the larger leaves like this one, while the surface is still damp, sometimes I like to add more indigo into the mixture for a darker and deeper green. With this set though, you can always come up with your own color mixtures depending on the tones that you're looking for. Just like the peony flower, I'm going to add an additional stem as well as leaves to help frame the flower on the side. After adding on these leaves though, I still feel like there's space for more petals to make this flower even larger. So I mixed in my light pink from Quin Red, Titanium Gold Ochre, as well as a touch of indigo. And I'm going to use this in a really light consistency. Here I add a little bit of Quin Red for a color that is slightly more vibrant and slightly darker in value. I'm still using a really light consistency though to paint some outlines for the extra petals. I feel like there's this sharp transition between the dark pink and the light pink, so I'm going to work on the value a little bit more closer to the center. I'm not going to do this all over though, I just want to add a thin layer of the same base color with extra Quin Red in a light consistency for some of the petals, especially the ones closer to the center. Still using the same colors, sometimes I like to just add one line for one side of the petal to indicate some folds, and also a slightly darker value in between some of the petals in front. As I start to see the form taking shape, I'm becoming a little bit more brave with my color by adding a thicker consistency in between those petals again. I don't want to overwork this and I feel like this is enough detail. So now I'm going to add a little bit more detail to the leaves to balance it out with the textures that we've painted on the flower. Just using the same green mixture, and I'm painting on the midrib as well as some of the veins. You can also add a slightly darker value to the side of the stem to give it a little bit more of a round cylindrical form. And this is the finished dahlia. Now let's move on to the final flower, which will be irises. For this, the petals look kind of different than a normal flower. Generally, we can see around 6 petals, 3 at the top and 3 at the bottom. Depending on the angle we're looking at, some of the petals might look thin if we're looking at it from the side, and some might be a little bit thicker. I like to think of this as leaf shapes that is a little bit softer and more frilly, and those frills are more wavy in texture instead of it being pointy and sharp. For the budding flowers, I like to think of this as the basic leaf shape, and I do want this to be smaller than the actual flower. For the sepals, since they're still sticking to the flower bud, I just like to add diagonal lines depending on which angle we're looking at. You can also paint the petals closer together at the top and this is what it will look like. You can actually look up for references if you want to include more petals, but I'm just simplifying this so it's easier to paint. Generally, irises have different colors at the center of the petals, which I'm going to indicate here with my sketch. As for the leaves, I'm going to make them grow out from the ground close to the main stem and make them really nice and long. After this, I'm going to go over the colors. We're going to be using a little bit more colors for this one, starting with Mineral Violet by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and Chinese White by Holbein. For these irises, I want the top petals to be pink, the bottom to be purple, and the center to be a bright yellow. I'm starting with the same pink mixture from Titanium Gold Ochre with Quin Red, and I'm going to use a very thin consistency by adding water slowly. I want the load on my brush to be fairly light or medium load, and I'm going to start painting the top petals. Starting from the center, then I just create a curved line going towards the center again and adding the frills around the outer edges. I want to include two main flowers in this composition, so I'm going to paint another one while I wait for the paint of the first flower to settle. After this, I'm going to go back to the first flower. Since the first flower is now completely dry, I'm going to somewhat re-wet the surface ever so slightly. I'm only dampening a little bit for the center petal in the middle, and I'm using a mix of Mineral Violet with Quin Red to just paint around the edges, so you can see some sharp edges around the top, and as it gets towards the center, you can see the paint slightly mingling with each other. As for the second flower, it wasn't as wet as the first flower since I left a little bit of time in between, and it's just the right dampness for me to add the secondary color for the tip of the petals. Next, I'm going to add the purple petals at the bottom, and for this I used the same Mineral Violet with Quin Red, and this time I added some Chinese White to turn the purple into a pastel tone. I also left out a little bit of negative space in the middle of the petal. Then while it's still damp, I used a slightly thicker consistency of Mineral Violet to paint around the edges, and I also added a really thick consistency of New Gamboge for the center of the petals. I'm also going to apply the New Gamboge for the top petals as well. Next, I'm going to add the petals on the left and the right. I'm just going to paint both of them at the same time. For the petal on the left, though, I'm only going to show the side view, which is why this is slightly thinner compared to the one on the right. So for the left side, I'm only going to paint one side for the darker value. Again, while the surface is still slightly damp, I'm going to add a thick consistency of the yellow. And for the top petal, I felt like the yellow was too strong compared to the pink, so I added an additional color from a mix of New Gamboge and a little bit of Quin Red as a slight transition between those two colors. For the second one, though, I ended up just using the really deep orange mixture from New Gamboge and a bit of Quin Red, and I softened the blend using a clean damp brush so you can see a slight glow from the yellow as well. For a slight variation and a different angle, for the second flower, I only want to include two petals which are facing forwards, so the petals look a little bit thicker compared to the one on top. This is an example of an area that's puddling wet. You can see some extra pigment as well as water, so I just pick up the excess using a clean dry brush. This way the base color won't be overly wet, even though it's still fairly damp compared to what I've painted at the top. And because of this extra dampness, you can see that the dark purple is traveling a little bit further than before. Next, I'm going to mix up a green tone from titanium gold ochre and a little bit of indigo. And you can see that this turns the green into a muted pastel tone, which I really like. And since the position of the petals at the bottom for the second flower is more open in the middle, you can see some of the sepals underneath, whereas the one at the top is not visible. For a slight variation for the second stem here, I added a bit of new gamboge into the mixture, which creates a slightly lighter green that is more of a yellow green. And I'm also going to use the same mixture to paint the leaves. To paint the leaves, I like to drag my brush in the direction of either ends of the leaves and slightly wiggling the brush to get a slight movement or a curve. Generally, their leaves are quite straight, but I'm just doing this for the sake of interpretation. And for some of the wider leaves, I like to leave a bit of negative space or negative line in between as the midrib texture. As for the flower bud, I just use the same purple as the flower, and I just create this narrow shape, continued with the sepal underneath using the same green as the leaves. I'm also going to add a bit of overlapping with this flower because I want to include the contrast of the light pink petals with the dark green leaves placed behind. For some of the wider leaves, I like to add another layer at the center using the same green still, just in a slightly thicker consistency, so it looks like the sides are slightly curled in. Next, I want to add a little bit of lines in different lengths for the center of each petal, and this is just to add a slight texture. I'm using the light purple mixture in a dry to light brush load, and I want to keep this in a very light consistency so those lines are subtle and not glaring. You can also switch to a smaller brush if it makes it easier to paint those thin lines. I want the center of the flowers to pop out more, so here I'm using a mix of new gamboge and Quin Red in a fairly thick consistency. Next, let's make all the colors pop out a little bit more by adding the darker values. I'm starting with the greens here. I just added more indigo into the green mixture, and I'm adding this as shadow around the folds of the leaves as well as parts of the stem. For this particular leaf, I'm using a slightly thicker consistency. I want to really create that nice contrast between the dark green and the light pink petal. I want to add a slightly darker value for the petals as well, starting with the dark purple here. I'm just using a medium to thick consistency to paint around the petal. For some of them, I don't go around every single part, so it looks natural and slightly uneven. By the way, for this dark purple, I added a touch of indigo to make an even deeper purple. Next, I want to soften those sharp edges, and I also want to tone down the brightness of the color. So here I'm using a mix of mineral violet with a little bit of indigo and also the very slightest bit of new gamboge as the opposite color to make this a little bit muddy. I'm using a really thin consistency to help blend the edges around the petals, but I'm also treating this as a slightly darker value for some of the petals. I'm also going to do the same thing for the pink petals, so I'm just going to add a little bit of the Quin Red and also some titanium gold ochre. And again, I'm using a really light consistency with a lot of water in the ratio. I mostly want to place this darker value for the petals on the left and the right. This is so it looks like the one in the middle is popping out slightly and the ones on either sides are slightly further back. I'm just going to make some final touch-ups to balance out everything, and that's basically it for the final flower. I hope you guys enjoyed this simple flower set, and if you found this tutorial useful, feel free to subscribe and click on the bell icon to get notified of new tutorials coming every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools will be in the description box along with my social media links. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!